Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, in Politics on Trial, I'm talking to Julian Jackson, the preeminent British historian of modern France, about the trial that in many ways helps to define modern France, post-war France, and to define the post-war order and many of the questions that lie in the background to it. Who collaborated with whom? It's the trial in the summer of 1945 in Paris of Marshal Pétain. We have had lots of requests over the course of this series for particular trials, but also to discuss particular books with their authors. And no book has been requested more than Julian Jackson's remarkable history of the trial of Marshal Pétain. The book is called France on Trial, and in many ways it exemplifies what we're trying to do in this series, because it takes the trial of Pétain in 1945 and it uses it to open up a whole set of questions about the politics of the period, but more than that, about how politics is defined, what makes a nation, what makes a state, what does it mean to be a traitor, what is being betrayed, who can legitimately speak for France. That's what this trial was about. Just a little bit by way of context, it is the trial of Marshal Philippe Pétain, who had been the great French hero of the First World War, in particular the hero of the Battle of Verdun, the terrible battle that cost the lives of up to 1 million French soldiers, but became a symbol of French defiance, and ultimately not just a Pyrrhic victory, but a symbol of victory when the war was won. And Pétain was the embodiment of that defiance and that victory. In the 1920s and the 1930s, he was in many ways a man above politics, but he came back as a very old man in 1940, when France was once again at war with Germany, indeed, when Nazi Germany had invaded France and the French army was in retreat and disarray. Pétain was brought back into the government, and then he came to head the government, and he signed the armistice with Hitler, which ended the fighting. It was effectively an act of surrender, though technically not quite that. And Pétain was then the man who established the Vichy regime, and many of the questions in the trial turn on the nature of the Vichy regime under Pétain. Was it a collaborationist regime? Was it effectively a tool of the Nazi state? Or did it offer protection for the French people against the Nazi state and what Hitler would have liked to do in France? Did Pétain somehow stop some of that? The prosecution and the defense in this trial argue this question out in a public court. In the summer of 1940, when Pétain was effectively ending the war with Nazi Germany, Charles de Gaulle left in June and continued the fight from London on behalf of what he called the Free French. And the trial also turned on the question of who could legitimately claim to speak for France from 1940 on. Was it Pétain, the head of state, the head of what may or may not have been a legitimately constituted state? Or was it de Gaulle, who had an idea of France and an idea of the fight continuing, even though he had almost no forces at his disposal? When Pétain came back in the summer of 1945, de Gaulle was also back and now the head of the provisional French government. And the contest between de Gaulle and Pétain to speak for France was a large part of what this trial was about. And as we will hear, the arguments that came out of the trial in many ways continue in French politics to this day, 80 years later. This is the story of post-war France. But we begin in the summer of 1945 with the question of how the trial of Marshal Pétain actually came about. Julian, maybe we should start. We'll go much more into the background, but start with the circumstances of the trial itself. It happened quite quickly after the end of the war. It happened in July 1945, and Pétain came back to France in April. So 3 months after his return, he'd been held in a kind of weird semi-palatial captivity by the Germans as a government in exile since the liberation, but it wasn't really a government in exile. He was more like a hostage. But when he was released is it fair to say he chose to return to France? And did he choose to return to France because he wanted to defend himself, or he felt he had no choice?
No, I think that's a good way to begin. But unfortunately, you're beginning with a question that I can't totally answer because I ponder it myself. So he was, as you say, at the last months of the war, kind of a prisoner of the Germans in this gilded cage in a weird sort of Disney-like castle in Baden-Baden called Sigmaringen. And there was all the sort of the dregs of collaboration and the Vichy regime were all holed up there. It would make a wonderful play because you have all these people who are stuck together but hate each other for all kinds of different reasons. Most of them, when they realize it's all over, are desperate, as it were, to get away. So some go underground, some go into exile in Spain. Laval, Pétain's number 2 as an example, although in the end he's extradited back to France. But Pétain is different from all the others in the sense that he does everything he can to return to France. There's a chance, for example, it would have embarrassed the Swiss, but there was some sense that the Swiss government would have given him some kind of refuge and so on. But no, he insists on coming back to France. He crosses into Switzerland in the last minutes of the Third Reich. He crosses Switzerland and he presents himself at the French frontier to return to France and face the music, so to speak. Why? It's sort of insoluble, the question, because I think one answer is that he was a patriot. He thought he had done the best for France, and he wanted to give his account. I think for 4 years he'd been living in a bubble of adulation, like most dictators do, and he had lost touch with what was really being thought about him. And it has to be said that in the last days of the Vichy regime, there had been a sort of flurry of new popularity for Pétain, which seems quite counterintuitive to us. The reason being that he sort of represented himself as the grandfather of the French people by visiting cities that had been bombed by the Allies, and he would go and empathize with the victims and so on. And that kind of re-established the reputation he'd had at the beginning as a sort of protector. And there's a famous incident that happened in April 1944 when he pays his only visit to Paris in the whole period of the occupation. And it would be wrong to say there are crowds cheering him, but a lot of people do turn out to cheer him for all kinds of mixed motives. Doesn't mean they love Pétain. But for all those sorts of reasons, I think he possibly thought, well, I'm still loved by the French people, and I want to explain myself. I think he must have been very quickly disabused, because what happens is he presents himself at the French frontier. The French Republican guards who are there to, greet him. So on the Swiss side, he's treated with great deference. He crosses over and they refuse to salute. The general, a hero of the resistance, Koenig, who de Gaulle has sent to receive Pétain, refuses to shake his hand, and Pétain's very taken aback. And then, as his train is setting off to go to Paris, there's a small demonstration of, resistors, communists and so on, and the carriage is pelted with stones. And I think there must have been a sort of Louis XVI Varennes moment when he realized that it wasn't going to be what he'd hoped it had been. But so the answer is, I think that at some level, he was still the prisoner of his own myth.
And he was returning to a country that was being led, the provisional government, by de Gaulle, who was in many ways his nemesis. So he was returning to a country where he knew he was placing himself in the hands, not exactly of his enemy, but of the man who was the opposite of him in many respects in the eyes of the French people. How ambivalent was de Gaulle about his return? So was there a real hunger, appetite from the new provisional government to put him on trial, or did they think this was risky, in part because of his popularity? No one could be quite sure, but also because so much dirty laundry would have to be aired. If this was going to be a treason trial, and we'll come on to the question of what he was actually charged with, but if this was going to be a treason trial of this one man, it would inevitably draw in all sorts of people who are hoping to play a part in the new regime. So how high were the stakes on the other side?
Well, de Gaulle and everybody in the new order, the new France, the France of what's going to become the Fourth Republic, believe that it is necessary to have a number of trials to judge the traitors. And it was inevitable. The day that de Gaulle, from almost his first speech in London, de Gaulle said that the day of accountability will come. It had to happen. Transitions of that kind require some kind of passage from one moment to another moment. And the French call this period, these purges, they use the term épuration, which means a purge, but it also has a sort of connotation of purification, of cleansing. So I think there's a sense in which these trials globally are about not just punishing the guilty, but also a kind of a national catharsis, a removal of the abscess of the canker to make symbolically a new France. So there are going to be trials, and for the really big people, as you know, the most important people, they set up a special high court, which is where Pétain will be tried. For lesser collaborators, other courts are used and so on. So there's this whole process which starts immediately after the liberation. I mean, de Gaulle arrives back in Paris, in liberated Paris on the 25th of August 1944, and the first trials, not of the big fish, but of lesser collaborators, let's call them, start within a month in September 1944. And it's bad luck if you're one of the people caught at the beginning, because emotions are highest at the beginning. And they begin actually with writers, partly because writers are very easy to prosecute in the sense that it's all out there. They've published. To try an industrialist is very complicated. You've got to find out, well, what has he done? You've got to go down and count books. You've got to work out what's exactly happened. Whereas a writer's written the stuff and it's there, you simply get the articles and you decide whether you think they're treasonous or not. And so it begins with people who actually often did nothing unless words or actions, which in a case like that they can be. But obviously, the most important trial was going to be the leaders. Now, the paradox when the trials open is that most of the leaders of Vichy are in this strange exile government that we talked about. There are one or two who are in France. And so the first people to be tried by the High Court, this special new court that's set up for the purpose of judging the leaders of the Vichy regime, are figures that not without importance, but not, absolutely front-rank figures. There's a general who had fought the Gaullists in Syria, and there's an Admiral Esteva who had allowed the Germans into Tunisia and so on. So this is not nothing, but it's obviously not household name. Now, de Gaulle sees it as inevitable that Pétain needs to be put on trial. It's the cry of the resistance, but I think he sees it as a necessary catharsis, as we mentioned before, also a kind of legitimizing of the new of himself. In a sense, his legitimacy must rest partly on establishing the non-legitimacy of what came before. So for all those reasons, it's necessary, but, and there is a big but here, de Gaulle would have preferred, in the case of Pétain, a trial in absentia. He'd have preferred the trial to happen, but Pétain would quietly take refuge in Switzerland. He wouldn't be present. And why did he want that? Because, as you suggest, he was aware of the really, let's not call it popularity of Pétain, but the fantastically complicated emotional relationship that the French had with Pétain. I mean, popularity, he was in 1940 popular in a way that's almost unimaginable. He was almost like a god. It's not the case in 44, but the French have these terribly complicated views about the man who was their First World War hero, in a way that I don't think any other European country quite had a hero of the Pétain style. Haig doesn't cut it, in that way, and I don't think Hindenburg either. Partly because Pétain was associated with the symbolic Battle of France, which is Verdun, and partly he was seen, and not without some justification, as one of those First World War generals who really did care about the common soldier. He was thought to be somebody who wasn't just going to send them across the trenches to be mown down. And he played a role in ending the mutinies in the French armies in 1917. So he has this really very complicated relationship in the emotional minds of the French. And de Gaulle is totally aware of that. And it was clear that with the presence of the old man, he's 90, and there is something very poignant, obviously, about the seeing a former hero, an old man, alone in a courtroom and so on. And so de Gaulle, I think, had seen all the potential poignancy and moral drama of the situation, which is why, although he believed it was necessary, he would have preferred it to happen in absentia. De Gaulle had a slightly caustic sense of humour, and he said to somebody, if only somebody just slipped a bit of poison into his coffee, we'd be rid of him. And he doesn't mean that he wanted. De Gaulle was not the assassin type, but he would have wished the problem would just go away. At another point, he said, "Pourquoi est-ce qu'il vient nous emmerder? Why is he coming to cause trouble again? Why doesn't he just retire to his villa in the south of France?" So he's aware of the problem, but he's faced with Pétain, and so he's got to go through with it. There's no choice.
Various people during the trial do make the comparison with the trial of Louis XVI, the regicide trial in the Revolution. Partly, I think, because, as you said, the symbolic value of this trial is to legitimize the new regime, as in that case. But also because, as you suggested, Pétain's status is so different from any of the others. He's not a king, he's not a monarch, but he was the physical embodiment of France. This has something to do with the look of the man as well, the extraordinary, iconic status that his picture had in French households. He was an icon of the nation. And so to put him on trial was risky in part because you're also putting the nation on trial. And then there's also the parallel with no one in 1792-93 knew exactly how far the king's popularity extended out into the countryside in the places away from the cities where the trial was happening. And there was a similar dynamic here. Is there anything to those comparisons that were made at the time?
I think there is. And your point, Pétain is in some case the symbol of France, is absolutely right. I chose to call the book France on Trial because it seemed to me that what they were doing was trying somebody who is the best sort of possible representation, physical representation you could have. Not only had he, as it were, been in charge, so he had been head of state under Vichy, but he was sort of more than that. And they were famous when he visited Lyon in 1940. The Archbishop said, "Pétain la France et la France et Pétain." Lots of people were saying that and so on. And it goes back, you're absolutely right also to say, the Pétain myth is not only about the role he played in the First World War, but he looked the part. He was a great seducer. In his youth, he was a great seducer. And in his old age, he was a great seducer. He's this noble, they always talk about the visage marmorien, the marble visage of the Marshal with the piercing blue eyes. He looks, until he really is very old, he looks much less than his age. And so there's so many things. He's the seducer, the hero, and the father and the grandfather. He's so many things, which gives him something of the aura that monarchy has. And it's interesting that his main defender at the trial, a young lawyer called Jacques Izorny, who was the star of the Pétain trial, although Pétain was convicted, Izorny put up the best possible defense for him. And even people who hated Pétain thought Izorny had been remarkable. And it's interesting that Izorny went on in the early days after the trial. It wasn't possible to make speeches defending Pétain at the time. In the early 50s, he was too much of a non-person. So Izorny used to go around giving lectures on Louis XVI, and everybody sort of got the coded message. So yes, there's something of that sense of more than just what is a normal traitor, but normal. There's something extraordinary in the fact that he is not just the leader, but he has this aura about him. And going back to de Gaulle, what makes de Gaulle very interesting is that by the end of the 30s, he had known Pétain quite well. He'd worked for him. He'd been commanded by him at Verdun as a very young captain, but he then worked in his cabinet in the 19... He'd worked to help him write a history of the French army. And de Gaulle used to say often, sort of again in that sort of slightly sardonic way that he had, Pétain was a great man who died in 1925, which is a curious year to choose because it's the year that de Gaulle actually started to work in his cabinet. But what he meant by that was, seeing him up close in 1925, he realized that something had atrophied, that he was no longer, he wasn't senile, obviously not, but he was no longer really... His mind had sort of slightly frozen, and he'd become a prisoner of his myth and all that. So that meant that in 1939, unlike most French politicians who went on, even people of the left, let's give an example to show the reverence that people felt for Pétain. Léon Blum, the great socialist politician and leader of the Popular Front, a kind of moral icon for the French left, a great man. When Pétain was appointed by the French government as ambassador to Franco's Spain in 1939, a goodwill gesture to try and build relations with the man who had obviously won the Civil War. So the French government sent Pétain, and Blum said, how terrible to send our glorious, venerable hero to this fascist regime. So everybody, in a sense, is buying into the Pétain myth, except de Gaulle, who'd worked with him at very close quarters. So yes, it has something of the poignancy and the gravity and the depth of the trial of Louis XVI. People also talk about Joan of Arc. They talked about Charles I. Those comparisons were made, and it really is France on trial. So I think the comparisons that you've made historically were very much in people's minds.
And yet there was another case that was also brought up, particularly by his most fervent enemies, communists above all, who liked to call him Pétain Bazaine. So Bazaine was François Bazaine, who had been the commander-in-chief of the French army in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and had surrendered his army to the Prussians. He hadn't then presided over 4 years of Prussian rule. In his case, the treason was solely focused on the surrender. So that comparison is interesting, and this relates to what we're going to talk about, which is the case against Pétain. But if you really want to focus that the comparison here is with this case a couple of generations earlier of the betrayal of the country, then the case has to rest on what happened in 1940. If he is Pétain Bazaine, the argument is he is the man who surrendered France. So the communists were saying that. Were other people saying and thinking that? Did that comparison have purchase? Because historically, it's not particularly analogous. It's, after all, Pétain did not surrender the army in the field, among other things.
I think it was a slightly lazy comparison. Bazaine was, obviously today, there's not a soul in France who's heard of Bazaine, but because it was obviously a moment linked to the previous great defeat of France in 1870-71. So the parallel is there. And at one level, I suppose, the comparison is about reducing Pétain from a hero to simply a banal military traitor. So, let's not see him, let's not deify him. Let's just say he's a military man who betrayed his country. So I think it's almost kind of a way of situating and diminishing at the same time the kind of man he was. But of course, why I say it's a slightly lazy comparison, the easy one, is that for the communists, of course, what happened after 1940 is it's not that they're not interested in collaboration and all that and so on. So I'm not sure there's huge significance in the communists picking on that, except the one that I've just offered.
So we're going to talk about the trial itself. This was not a show trial. We've just done a couple of episodes about the Moscow show trials. This is not a show trial in that sense at all. This is not some complete contrivance based on false confessions and the rest. But in other ways, that phrase show trial has all sorts of different connotations. It was a kind of show trial. It was a performance. It was there to serve a function beyond merely letting justice take its course. It was an unusual trial in that it was a jury trial. So in the case of Louis XVI, the question who could put him on trial was answered by the convention. That is, it was, in a sense, the politicians of France, of the new regime, who would have to try the figurehead of the old regime. In this case, a jury was created, but it was two juries. And looking at it from the outside, these are not impartial juries. So this is not like the Anglo-Saxon jury of 12 people who can form an opinion. Tell us a little bit about that. So these two juries, each of whom had to reach a verdict on this case, one jury made up of members of the resistance, the other of politicians, parliamentarians, is that right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I struggled over the term show trial because I take your point, a show trial can be many different kinds of things. And it's not like the Moscow trials, but it is a show trial if a trial in which the outcome is, when I say absolutely clear in advance, I'll qualify that slightly because there was a discussion among the jurors at the end as to what sentence would be appropriate. But that he would be found guilty was the point of the trial. The trial was to show something, to demonstrate something. It was a kind of a chance for the French to be given a version of the history that they had just lived through, an instant history lesson. And yes, there are all kinds of ways in which, it is irregular in normal legal terms. Let's just take, for example, the case of the judge. There were three judges, which is normal in a French trial, but the leading trial judge had, like all judges under the occupation, sworn an oath of loyalty to Pétain, which was required by the Vichy regime. It invented a formal oath of loyalty to the person of Marshal Pétain. So the people who are judging Pétain have sworn an oath to him, which of course the defence played on a lot. So there are all these moral ambiguities. Let's take another one. The main prosecutor, rather unsavoury man called André Mornay, who had been a sort of specialist all his career in prosecutions for treason. In the First World War, he was the man who had prosecuted Mata Hari, the famous, notorious French spy. So he had form, as it were, which is one reason why he was chosen. Now, he was also chosen partly because he had not sworn the oath of loyalty to Pétain, which was also required of prosecuting magistrates. The reason he'd not sworn it, however, was simply he had retired formally just before the oath was required. But he isn't untouched, as it were, by complicity with what's happened before, because Mornay, the man who is charging Pétain with all kinds of things, had been on a commission that Vichy had set up in 1940, almost one of the first things it did, which was to review the cases of French citizens who had been naturalized in the 1920s and 30s. Now, what does that mean? In simple terms, it means denaturalizing French Jews who'd arrived as refugees because Vichy had an anti-Semitic agenda and so on. So Mornay had been on a Vichy-founded organism to denaturalize French Jews, and there he is judging Marshal Pétain. So there is a lot of moral ambiguity, but let's take the case of the jury, because in some ways that will also demonstrate both your point about this is not totally regular, but also that it is not totally a show trial. For the High Court, the plan was there would be 24 jurors. 12 of them were selected from leading members of the resistance, and so resistance movements were required to give forward names. And the other 12 were parliamentarians, because remember, in 1940, France was a functioning parliamentary democracy, which was basically abolished by Vichy. But Pétain, in 1940, had presented himself before the sort of what could be assembled of the existing parliament to ask for full powers to amend the constitution, which he then simply used to institute an effectively authoritarian regime. A certain number of parliamentarians refused to vote for him, and only from that group were selected those parliamentarians. So, again, it's totally skewed. There's absolutely no question about it. Having said that, we know, for example, that the jury at the end of the trial debated well into the small hours of the night what would be the appropriate sentence. Should it be the death penalty? Should it be a more minor infringement of the penal code and so on? And I was able to find one of the most interesting discoveries I made was the diary of one of the resistance jurors. Now, this was a man, remember, the resistance wasn't all people of the left. There were many conservatives who were appalled by what Pétain had done and so on. And he was a man, essentially a conservative, who had been against Pétain from the very beginning, had taken major risks. He's called Jacques Lecomte Boinet. He'd taken major risks in the resistance. He wasn't just one of these people who said he was a resistor. This man was a serious resistor who had been appalled by so much of the Vichy regime. But once he's selected as a juror, one thing he doesn't like is some of his fellow jurors who are communists and have decided on day one that Pétain is Bazaine, must be executed, guillotined. But he says, well, my duty is, whatever I thought about the Vichy regime, to hear what is said, to consider, to weigh up, etc., and then to make my decision. And what we have is a conservative man who is genuinely weighing up and listening, and after Laval appears and gives his testimony, he said, I hated Laval, but I can now see there are arguments and so on. So we have this sort of moral debate that's going on in this man's head for the 3 weeks of the trial. In the end, he votes for the death penalty, but he does it with no lightness of heart, and he does it for a very specific reason, and he's not sure that that's what he's going to do. His particular reason for doing it is that for him, the absolutely unacceptable moment was when Pétain gave his sort of blessing in 1941 to French volunteers to join a group called Volunteers Against Bolshevism, to fight with the German army in German uniform on the Eastern Front. And this man said, whatever you can say for Pétain, I realize now there are some arguments for him. You cannot forgive a Marshal of France who gives his blessing to French men who are going to fight with the Germans, whatever they're fighting against. And he says in his diary, and for that reason, I am a Pétainicide. And he's not happy about it, and he's depressed, but he does. So my point there is, yes, it is a skewed jury, but there is a debate. And my final point is that there are about 60 witnesses for the defense called, many of them high officials of the Vichy regime and so on. There is a real debate in the court. And if anything, people are surprised as the trial goes on how arguments are put in defense of Vichy that surprised opponents of Vichy. So, yes, show trial in the sense that he is going to be found guilty of something, but nothing like a Moscow show trial, and a trial in which there is a real debate, there are real defense witnesses, and there are jurors who are really thinking about the verdict they're going to pronounce.
And as the example of that juror whose diary you found makes clear, there were lots of different elements to the case against Pétain, and therefore lots of different grounds on which he could be found guilty of treason, but also by implication lots of different grounds on which it might be thought the case was weak. So that's a very given, and we're going to talk about the range of the charges against him. To alight on that also says something about the other charges too. So I'd like to sort of go through, in a way, the case against Pétain, because what's so fascinating about this trial is that the case has so many different elements. The charge is treason, but treason can mean many different things. Some of it relates to his conduct before the war. Some of it relates to his conduct specifically in June 1940. Some of it relates to his conduct during the period where he presided over the Free Zone, that part of France that was unoccupied. And some of it relates to his conduct after the Germans occupied the whole country. And these are different kinds of cases. They don't all necessarily mean treason in the eyes of the jurors, among others. And it's also very interesting the way the case was constructed, because, as you describe, the bit that the prosecution focused on, particularly at the start of the trial, is the weakest part of the case against him, which is his conduct before the war even began, or rather, before and then during the first year of the war, before he was called back into government, when he was in Spain. So there was an attempt to argue that Pétain had been involved in some kind of plot which then played out in Vichy, but the seeds of which had been laid before June 1940. And the grounds of this plot had actually taken place during the period where he was the French ambassador to Franco's Spain. So that in a way, there are two questions about that part of the case against him. Is there any plausibility to it? But also, why did the prosecution get so bound up in that? Is it because they were aware the other bits were much more complicated because they implicated France in various ways. Whereas if you can say there was this pre-war plot or this pre-June 1940 plot, you can identify the conspirators, but it's not a charge against the regime that surrendered in 1940.
If I can just preface the answer to this by just taking, so what is Petain's crime? So for de Gaulle, Petain's crime was simple, and that he had signed the armistice. And for de Gaulle, when you can still go on fighting, and it was possible to go on fighting from abroad, not necessarily in France, to have signed an armistice and saying it's all over was treason and giving up the country to be half occupied by the Germans. So de Gaulle was very simple. The armistice was the crime.
So in a way, for de Gaulle, the crime was not being de Gaulle. I mean, de Gaulle showed what you should have done, and Pétain did the opposite.
Absolutely. And dates are important. When does treason start? And for de Gaulle, treason starts on the 16th of June, 1940. That's a month before the Vichy, or a few weeks before the Vichy regime is properly set up. Why? De Gaulle leaves for London on the 17th of June. And he leaves for London because he realizes that the new government of Pétain is going to sign an armistice. Pétain has said that that's what he's going to do. So de Gaulle, it's quite simple. That was the treason. But a lot of people were much less sure about that when it came to the trial itself. A lot of anti-Pétain Third Republic politicians, when actually asked, was the armistice treason? They said, no, there are lots of other things, but there was a case for the armistice. But let me take another name. So de Gaulle, it was the armistice. But somebody of great intellectual and moral stature, the philosopher Raymond Aron, who was a young man at the time, not the important liberal philosopher he's to become after the war, but had arrived in London, spent the whole war in London, founded or was one of the leading contributors to a newspaper called La France Libre, which wasn't the official de Gaulle paper, and he wrote really powerful articles against the Vichy regime. But when it came to the trial in 1945, Aron said, in my opinion, for all that I wrote against Pétain, the armistice was a necessary and justifiable action in 1940 to end what was becoming a pointless massacre of the civilian population. Some kind of end to the fighting was necessary, and that could be justified. And for me, he said, Pétain's crime dates to November 1942, when the Allies took over North Africa, Algeria, Morocco and Tunisia, which had been in Vichy hands. And he said, and then the Germans occupied the so-called free zone because they were worried that the Allies otherwise might land on the southern French coast. So Aron says, at that point, there's nothing left to defend. Pétain could claim he was a kind of screen, barrier, shield, whatever you want, between the Germans. Even if imperfectly there's a case for that, after November 42 there's no case. So for him the date is November 42. Other people have other dates. So there is from the very beginning this uncertainty about what date you choose and what the essence of the crime is.
So for the prosecution, they wanted to start not in 1940, not in 42, but in 39.
Absolutely, yeah. Basically, the first week of the trial was wasted by the prosecution attempting to prove a case for which, after the first week, the prosecutor himself said, I don't give up the idea, but I don't actually have the full evidence for it, so let's move on to something else, i.e. the Vichy regime. Now, why do they do that? I think one reason is laziness. That's to say, remember that they had to assemble the evidence against Pétain with rapidity. He arrives back in April 1945. The trial starts in July. There is already a mountain of material coming out of the Vichy ministries and so on. It becomes more and more mountainous over the years. And everybody felt this trial must happen quickly, that it's a sort of suppurating sore. It's got to be, the boil has to be lanced. And I think that some people have said to me, well, why didn't they wait 2 years? You couldn't have waited 2 years. You had to. There had to be a sort of break. So it had to happen fast. Building the case from this mass of material was difficult, complicated, a lot of work. Mornay was quite lazy, I think. And so what they could use were polemics written by French exiles in the United States, who basically left France in 1940, went to the States, and then wrote attacks on Pétain. Now, these were people who hadn't lived in Vichy France, and they were still stuck in the 1930s, the rise of the extreme right, the French version of fascism, etc. So they constructed a sort of idea that Pétain had been one of a group of conspirators, and there were conspirators wanting to topple the Republic and so on. And partly it was a kind of laziness, because actually Mornay's prosecution case is almost lifted directly from one of those polemics. But also something you said I think is also correct. If it could be proven that he was a conspirator, anti-republican, anti-democratic conspirator who wanted to topple the Republic, and was even pleased about the fall of France because it gave him the chance to do so, it is so clear that that is treasonous that it avoids having to approach all the other much more complicated questions about Vichy, because whatever else Vichy is complicated. Because the moment you start to unpick what goes on after 1940, there are pros and cons. So I think it was partly that kind of, it looked simple, and partly it avoided having to also open up the complicity of some of the people who were trying Pétain, the thing that I mentioned, the fact that Mornay has not untouched by complicity with the regime. But the problem was there really wasn't a case. And there were right-wing plots against the Republic in the 1930s. There was a mood of anti-parliamentarianism. And yes, Pétain was one of the figures that these conspirators, if you want to call them that, had in mind as the man who might take over. But between that and someone already proving that he was involved in plots was difficult, but that he was in any way involved in what you might call sort of fifth column activities, wanting the defeat of France in order to come to power, it was fantastical. And the evidence was so circumstantial, so implausible that they gave it up. And it was a bad week in the trial because it started to create, after the first week, a sort of sense, well, if he's not guilty of this, is he guilty at all? So it was a bad opening, and it was the worst angle of attack they could possibly have chosen.
It's a bit like those crackpot schemes that sort of floated around in the 1970s in Britain to replace the elected government with some kind of military dictatorship, and it was always either the Duke of Edinburgh or Mountbatten. And all one has to imagine is the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Philip, being put on trial. And I think he would legitimately have said, it's nothing to do with me.
No, I think that's a fair comparison. So it was a red herring and a mistake, yeah.
So then, against the instincts of the prosecution, because they knew at this point it got more difficult, the case had to move on to what happened from June 1940 onwards. In the case of the armistice itself, what's so interesting, and the trial has a complicated series of arguments about this. In a way, it turns on counterfactuals. It turns on the what-if questions. What else was possible in June 1940? What would have happened had the government of the Third Republic gone into exile, or alternatively simply retreated to North Africa and continued to claim from that space of French territory to govern a country that had been taken over by the Germans? Was that a realistic possibility? Could it have happened under Pétain, or did it have to happen under someone else? But it also raised the question of the fact the armistice was not the work of one man. And the man, Pétain, had been brought into government, initially as deputy prime minister and then made prime minister, under the terms of the Third Republic. So other politicians had acquiesced in this. And some of those politicians were then called as witnesses in this trial. Is it possible to make sense of the counterfactuals here? What do you think? So we'll come back to the trial itself, but as a historian, what were the options for the French government in June 1940? One option was clearly to fight on to the bitter end, to the last man, and so on. But on the question of whether the government should simply leave France and try to continue either from North Africa or from somewhere else. I believe someone, I can't actually now remember who, but someone said at one point, the trouble was when they made the comparison with what happened in the Netherlands, where there was a royal family that could go into exile. France didn't have a royal family, something different about politicians taking the government into exile. But Pétain, as we said, was the symbol of France. He could have symbolically removed himself. What do you think the realistic options were in June 1940?
So basically, within the government in the last 4 days or so before Pétain comes to power, there's a huge argument going on. The Prime Minister is a man called Paul Reynaud, who had sort of pitched himself to be the Clemenceau of the new war, who was admired by and liked by Churchill. So he was situating himself to be the Churchill of France in 1940. And what Reynaud wanted was, his view was, right, we all know that the army is defeated in France and any resistance can only be a holding operation. We have lost, but we have an empire. And so what we should do in North, and it's only separated by the Mediterranean, North Africa, the military leader, General Weygand, should call on the armies to capitulate in the field, say, just to end the fighting. But the government should go abroad, and previously whatever remnants of the army could be taken across the Mediterranean and so on, military material, and continue from North Africa, because to sign an armistice would be for the government. It officially says France is no longer in the war.
And crucially also the fleet. So the army was defeated, but the fleet wasn't. So to take the fleet so that the fleet could continue the fight.
Yeah, and the fleet could continue as well. Now, there's this battle in the government, and because Reynaud was maybe in a minority, but it was very close. But the problem was simply the sheer prestige of Pétain meant that he counted, for more votes than anybody else. Reynaud was crushed, in a sense, by the man who he'd brought in, as it were, to save the situation. Once Pétain is ready for an armistice, Reynaud sort of gives up the ghost and resigns. Let's assume he had not resigned. Let's assume he had gone to North Africa. And who would have gone with him? Well, his government and the president. So there's no queen or king, but there is a president, the president of a republic that's been there since 1870. Now, the man who made that remark that you mention, it's no comparison with Holland, because a president of the Third Republic doesn't have the historic stature of a monarch, was a monarchist. And it was a man who hated the Republic, and it was General Weygand, who was, for Reynaud, one of the villains of the peace, who with Pétain believed that it was all over. But let's assume, had the government gone abroad, the Germans would therefore have occupied the whole of the country. There wouldn't have been a government, as it were, left to negotiate within France. There would have been a total occupation of France. There are many possible counterfactuals. Would the Germans, in that case, have taken the decision that it was too dangerous to leave a French government operating in North Africa and found a way of crossing to North Africa, either through Spain via Gibraltar or whatever? Or would they have just left it there as an impotent rump? And let's assume that had happened. Then it could have gone to London. Why I think this matters hugely is that de Gaulle had to, as it were, reconstruct a legitimacy from nothing. When de Gaulle was in London, all he could say was, I'm a soldier who happened to have been in the last functioning government of the Third Republic. He gets a little bit of legitimacy from that. But he is nothing. And for the memory of the period, let's forget for the moment what would actually have happened. That France, that is to say, that the state has decided to give up and in some form or other do a temporary deal with Germany, remains a sort of suppurating wound in the French memory. All countries had to deal with collaborators, the Dutch and the Belgians and the Norwegians, but what they don't have to deal with is, as it were, the treason of the government. Even if the Belgian government in exile, the Dutch were ciphers, but they had that kind of moral legitimacy. So I think in that way it matters hugely. We ask the question, well, what would have happened in France? The Germans occupying the whole of France, would the situation of the French have been better or worse? That's a second count, because one of the defences of Vichy is, if we hadn't signed an armistice and we'd gone abroad, France would have been run like Poland by a Gauleiter. That argument was used again and again, to which the counter-argument is, well, in no Western European occupied country did the Germans behave as they behaved in Poland. So the sort of Gauleiter argument is a false one. We don't know what the Germans would have done. They'd have invented, presumably, some kind of... They might have used some French fascist puppets and so on, a la Norway, a Quisling in Norway. They might have imposed a civil administration. They would have used, French civil servants would have had to, as it were, more or less collaborate. But in the end, given how little, in practice, the Vichy regime did protect France from the consequences of the war. I think the counterfactual, the argument today resolves a lot, much more than at the trial, around, well, for example, would the fate of the French Jews have been worse or better with the Vichy regime? The view of most historians is that Vichy did very little in practical terms to save the Jews. So there are two issues. One is keeping alive abroad the existence of a virtual French state, what de Gaulle called his certain idea of France. Some people like to characterize de Gaulle as a kind of myth maker. Well, he was a myth maker, but he was also very shrewd. And his point was, if Vichy has lost its legitimacy by a government that has a system where there are foreign troops on its soil, has lost legitimacy. That was what he meant by legitimacy. And therefore somebody else has to incarnate that. So when he said, I am France, and, Churchill used to mock him as a Joan of Arc fantasist, on that he wasn't being a fantasist. He was saying somebody, and since no one else is doing it, I'm here to do it, has to be there to represent the continuity of the French state. Logically, it should have been the president, Lebrun, but he gave up. Logically, it could have been the prime minister, Reynaud, but he gave up. So there's that, as it were, symbolic sense of the continuity of the state, which you could say is only symbolic, but I think it does matter if you're a French person looking back on the period now. Pétain would have stayed in France, of course. So the Germans might have put Pétain in power as a puppet, but a Pétain puppet, a Pétain who'd stayed in France with the government abroad, would have been a different Pétain from the Pétain who stayed as the government. Now, you might, if you were Weygand, the monarchist, say, well, a Pétain has an aura and a legitimacy which transcends the legitimacy of a government of the corrupt Third Republic. But certainly his stature would have been diminished by the fact that there was something that could call itself the legitimate French government abroad. So they are counterfactuals, but they are the fascination. That counterfactual is, for me, the real fascination of this story.
One of the remarkable features of the trial, and you've just laid out some of this, is that it raises questions about what if, but it also raises questions about the definition of the state. What is the state? What is the nation? Is it its government? So can it exist in exile? Is it the people who are constituted under the terms of the Constitution? What happens when the Constitution comes to an end? These were questions that were live in 1792-93, so the comparison with the trial of Louis XVI holds. But this feels to me like a point where the personality of Pétain really matters, because as you say, he would have stayed. And Pétain didn't say much at the trial, but he gave a little speech at the beginning. He clearly did identify himself with France in various ways. He thought of himself as the protector and the shield. But he thought of France as the land. He thought of it as the physical space of France. He was not going to leave this country. And I suspect, I don't know, you can tell me if I'm wrong, this has something to do with Verdun. I mean, the blood of 1 million French soldiers lies in this territory, and to do it from North Africa didn't make sense for someone like Pétain. He was France, and he would remain there and in his own mind, do his best for the people who lived there, because that was the essence of what it meant to call a place France, to call something France from outside the motherland, let's call it that, didn't make sense for the man himself. And that it felt to me, even in his own statement, but also what other things said about him in the trial about June 1940, the extent of that identification of his person with this place, not just with this abstract idea or this constitution or this theory of the state, or even this idea, in contrast to de Gaulle, who had an idea of France. Pétain thought France was something you could touch. Even the symbolism of his return from Switzerland, the crossing the frontier, the disappointment of discovering it was not the place he thought it was. Do you think that is one of the places where his personality really does make a difference to this story?
Yes, or put very simply, Pétain is a peasant. I'm not using the term peasant in a simple pejorative term. Pétain came from the land. Pétain was a peasant and de Gaulle was an intellectual. And all the things you said about this whole mythology of the land soaked with the blood of the poilus of Verdun is all part of the whole hold that Pétain has and that Vichy has. You do not serve your country by deserting your country, by going. All that's absolutely part of the myth and the success of Pétain. There was a fascinating exchange between Pétain and de Gaulle in the 1930s, because you remember that de Gaulle had been working for Pétain as a kind of ghostwriter. De Gaulle was an intellectual who'd already shown that he was a good writer, so he joined Pétain's cabinet to help him write this history of the French army. And we have the correspondence between them, and so de Gaulle would write passages and then Pétain would annotate them to put them into his own style. And there's a passage about the French Revolution, about what happened to officers under the French Revolution. And de Gaulle's passage goes, in the turmoil of the revolution, these professional soldiers lost their lives, their something, and their honour. I can't remember how. And so Pétain crossed it out and put lost their honour and their something and their lives. And de Gaulle said, no, it's an ascending trilogy. It's honour that matters above all. Honour matters more than life. And I put that very badly, but you get the idea. It already encapsulates, in a sense, the debate between the land and the idea. They both talk about honour, but for de Gaulle, the honour is incarnated in a certain idea of the country. But I think what one must remember also, that you're right about the psychology, but there's also something that was also going on in his head, which he didn't express, which was, although there's no way that Pétain wanted the defeat of France, no way. So that whole notion that he was a traitor in the 30s, we've established that is nonsense. But he is one of those conservatives, and because he was a conservative, who saw that the defeat was an opportunity for renewal and recovery. And so he does see it as a chance to, like the conservatives around him, to impose a new kind of moral order, regenerate France, and so on. So underneath this talk of the soil, there is a hidden agenda, which is we will now, as it were, redeem it's almost a kind of a Christian vocabulary. I mean, ironically, Vichy talked about work, family, and fatherland, and some talked about God, but Pétain was an unbeliever married to a divorcee. De Gaulle was a very devout Catholic. And Pétain talked about family, but had no family and no children. He had married the divorcee late in life, his former mistress. So in terms of values, there's a kind of a curious inversion. So the rhetoric, as it were, of I'm staying here because you can't save France except on French soil, hides an agenda, which is the agenda for a new order. And I think that is very important in the sense that there's this whole issue of what is the crime of Pétain. So we've decided it wasn't a plot against the republics. We've agreed about that. Armistice, well, it's complicated. We can be Gaullist and say it was the armistice, or we can be Aronian and say it wasn't the armistice. Then we come to the next possible crime, which was the abolition of democracy, the abolition of the Third Republic, the setting up of an authoritarian, dictatorial regime. And the complication there, which was, as it were, the hidden agenda behind the I'm staying here. I'm not just staying here because I believe in France, I'm also staying here because I want to do something. And what I want to do is create a new, what he called a national revolution, a counter-revolution. And he's got a lot of people around him who've got very strong, he has rather simple ideas about politics. He's not stupid, but he's not a political thinker. They're simple ideas about, morality, the family. School teachers should inculcate values of patriotism. They're not very deep, but it's a sort of standard conservative position. But he's got ideologues around him. And the next big problem is this authoritarian dictatorship, whether we can call it that is set up, legal or illegal? Because it was actually voted by, Pétain was voted full powers by the last parliament of the Third Republic to revise the constitution. And although he doesn't go ahead and revise the constitution immediately, you can't do these things immediately. And so he uses those powers to, as it were, turn himself into a de facto, but possibly provisional dictator. And there was a whole question about the legality or not of that coup d'etat. Remember that the Vichy regime of Pétain was recognized by most governments around the world. The Americans had an ambassador at Vichy until April 1942. The Vatican had an ambassador at Vichy. Vichy was recognized, the British obviously not, but Vichy was recognized by most countries in the world. And then gradually, from the end of 42 to 43, its status is seen to have changed. So the problem about the legality of this new regime is itself very problematic. And one of the reasons that de Gaulle, and he admitted it himself to somebody in the 1960s who said to him, well, why do you go on about legitimacy the whole time? You use this word, we were the legitimate. And he said, well, because, we knew we were on thinner ice when talking about legality, because Vichy, it's a complicated, there were people tried to prove that the vote wasn't a free vote. There were lots of ways you could show that it wasn't, that there was some sharp practice. But nonetheless, on the question of legality, they were on somewhat thin ice. Of course, legitimacy is a very nebulous, but what is legitimacy? Because if legitimacy is in any way connected to your support, which it must be, 99% of French people in 1940 would have supported Pétain, and the 1% who'd heard of de Gaulle might have supported him or not. So the legitimacy one was also complex, but there was, in de Gaulle's mind, his legitimacy came, as I mentioned earlier, from the sense that he represented a state that wanted to be independent of any foreign power. And even if it was very virtual, it was an idea. So when we're looking at the crimes of Pétain, plot against the Republic, no. Armistice, complicated. Legality or coup d'etat. France is not in a good shape today, and there's lots of talk, and I find myself continuously being asked to talk about, the crisis of the regime in France today, both in France and in England. And I say, well, these things, remember that the origins of the Fifth Republic in 1958 are pretty dodgy, actually, and nobody contests, as it were, the legitimacy and legality of the Fifth Republic. So origins, how long do you carry the scar of your origins? I don't know. So that is another, as it were, murky moment when you're trying to define the crime of Pétain.
And hence the choreography, as you said earlier, of the jury selection to find the parliamentarians, the minority, who had not legally endorsed the Vichy regime. A reminder that if you enjoyed the first part of my conversation with the historian of Russia, Edward Acton, about the Moscow show trials, the second part, part 2, is available now as a bonus episode on PPF+. Edward and I discussed the third of the Moscow show trials in 1938, the terror, and also the particular case of Bukharin, the man who inspired some of the great political literature of the 20th century. Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, George Orwell's 1984. If you'd like to get that episode, you know what to do. Click on the link in the show description, go to our website, ppfideas.com, and you will immediately get access to all of our bonus episodes, past, present, and future, plus ad-free listening, and you will be supporting this podcast. We would be very grateful. Next time in Politics on Trial, it's part 2 of my conversation with Julian Jackson, in which we address, in many ways, the central question of the Pétain trial. Was the Vichy regime a collaborationist regime? And we talk about the issue which should have been central to the trial, but for very complicated and compromising reasons wasn't: the fate of France's Jews. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future.